Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 526 to hear an Oriole sing. This will take us, of course, back to poem 31 in our use of the Oriole, and then we'll as well see it when we get to poem 1466 that we'll talk about in a moment. Now, when this thing was published in 1891, it was actually titled The Oriole's Secret. Now, there's a really interesting debate about what this poem is actually about. I'm going to challenge you to think about this poem as another one of Emily's poems about poetry. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily on playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through a set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through as well the preceding 525 poems. We just finished with 525, I Think the Hemlock. Now, we're back to Emily as a poet thinking about herself as a bird. In this case, it will be the golden oriole, right? It won't be a sparrow or a robin. Here it will just be the oriole. Now, you'll maybe remember that we've commented a number of times in room 303 of that famous comment by Mozart, "The music is not, my friend, in the notes, but in the space between the notes." I think that we'll be playing a very similar game here. Now, the great scholar Wisher has commented on this poem, and I think it's worth our reading a little bit from his famous biography, one of the very earliest that was a poet. He says it this way, quote, "The gnomic concession of Emily Dickinson's poems is a continual stimulus to mental alertness." That we know for sure, right? "She does not encourage a dreamy half-attention on the reader's part. This may be made evident if we place one of her mildly puzzling poems beside a passage of similar content by a writer of very different quality. In A Song for Occupations, Whitman stated the transcendental conviction that the essence of a work of art is what exists in the mind of the audience, a conviction on which later critics have based the doctrine of, quote, significant form, end quote." And then Wisher quotes this famous passage from Song for Occupations. Of course, we've given full lectures on all of the poems of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We call that series Talks with Walt. Here, of course, calling our series now Chats with Emily. Back to A Song for Occupations. All music, again, this is Walt. All music is what awakens from you when you are reminded by the instruments. It's not the violins and the cornets. It's not the oboe, nor the beating drums, nor the score of the baritone singer singing in his sweet romanza, nor that of the men's chorus, nor that of the women's chorus. It is nearer and farther than they, end quote. And then Wisher continues, Whitman's method, as he explained it in one of his later prefaces, was to bring the reader within the quote-unquote atmosphere of an idea and there leave him to pursue his own flight. In the 3 lines quoted, the poet's control of the reader's mind is absolute in the initial statement of the thought. It is intentionally relaxed in the succeeding list of particulars and finally trails off in a faint, suggestive echo calculated to induce in the reader a state of reverie. Emily Dickinson's treatment of the same theme is, on the contrary, a succession of challenges to keep abreast of the poet in her progress toward precision. The song of the Oriole, she says, may appear a common thing, or it may strike us as divine. The difference is not owing to the bird, which sings precisely the same, whether there are listeners or not. Now, let's enjoy the poem, since we've kind of set ourselves up for it. She says it this way. To hear an oriole sing may be a common thing, or only a divine. It is not of the bird who sings the same unheard, as unto crowd, the fashion of the ear attireth it that it hear in dun or fair. So, whether it be ruin or whether it be none, is of within. The tune is in the tree, the skeptic showeth me. No, sir, in thee. Now, I love that we can compare two poets who were contemporaries but never apparently read each other's stuff. It's reported that Emily knew about Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, but had some lesser than statement to make about it, maybe because she had heard somebody comment on the Leaves of Grass poetry. She herself apparently never read any of Walt's stuff. But I think it's a good idea to follow Whisker here and to say what we commented already in Song of Occupations, and we've given those full lectures at learnstrong.net. You can again run that to ground. Here she says to start with the phrase "to hear." To hear an Oriole sing, again back to poem 31. When we get to poem 1466, we'll one more time we'll hear this comment about the Oriole, and yeah, when we hit this poem, we'll come back to it. One of the ones that Midas touched, who failed to touch us all, was that confiding prodigal, the reeling Oriole. So drunk he disavows it with bandage divine. So dazzling we mistake him for an alienating mind, a pleader, a dissembler, an epicure, a thief, becomes an oratorio, an ecstasy in chief. The Jesuit of orchards, he cheats as he enchants of an entire attar for his decamping wants. The splendor of a Burma, the meteor of birds, departing like a pageant of ballads and of bards. I never thought that Jason sought for any golden fleece, but then I am a rural man with thoughts that make for peace. But if there were a Jason tradition, bear with me, behold his lost aggrandizement upon the apple tree. I mean, it's brilliant the way she ends, of course, with the referencing to Genesis 3 and Milton as well. And I think there is some of Milton in this poem, and I think for sure there's some of Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. Notice, to hear an Oriole sing may be a common theme. From common we'll go to done later. Or only, I think maybe the key word of the poem, a divine. It's brilliant. In other words, whether the song of the bird is brilliantly divine or it is common will depend upon you, the listener. And obviously Shelley's To a Skylark is hiding behind some of this as well. We look before and after and pine for what is not our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught, right? Then stanza 2, it is not of the bird who sings the same unheard as unto crowd, the fashion of the ear. In other words, whether the bird sings to a whole bunch of people, a crowd, or just to a single person, it doesn't matter. It's still beautiful. And then she'll use the word attireth, which of course means clothed, right? That adhere in done, common, or fair, as in divine. So, it's almost as if she's making an argument specifically about her own poetry. It doesn't really matter whether lots of people read my poems and hear my poetry and hear my song, my Oriole song or not. It doesn't matter. So, whether it be ruine, R-U-N-E, that is to say, true poetry or poetical, or whether it be none, is of within. In other words, whoever decides what quality of my poems are, she says, it'll have to do with the reader himself, herself. You will remember, of course, that she said it in This Is My Letter to the World That Never Wrote to Me. You'll recall in 441, Judge, sweet, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me, you'll remember, right? The quote now, tune is in the tree. In other words, the song is in the bird, right? The, if you will, poem's versification. The skeptic showeth me. Now, I think this word skeptic is the key word. She only uses this word skeptic one other time, and it's in 1413. When we get there, we'll come back to her use of it here. She says it this way, sweet skepticism of the heart that knows and does not know, and tosses like a fleet of balm affronted by the snow, invites and then retards the truth, lest certainty be sire, compared with the delicious throw or transport thrilled with fear. Brilliant, brilliant poem. We'll come back to it. Emily the skeptic is Emily a skeptic herself. Showeth me, notice the dash with showeth me. No, sir, the tune is not in the tree. Where is the tune? It is in thee. In other words, you get to determine the value of the song of the bird, of the Oriole, not the bird and not the tree. When we get to 685, we'll come back to play a similar game, and we'll remind ourselves that we were here already. Because this is the way she says it in a two-line, brilliant kind of collection of this poem. Again, just the ability to just really shorten everything down. She says it in 2 lines. Not revelation, 'tis that waits, but our unfinished eyes. unfurnished eyes. It's pure Plato as well, isn't it? Coming out of the darkness of the cave into the light of the sun. What are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? Well, I think she argues that to the great artist, the work remains important, whether it's to a crowd or just to one person. Now, Whistler went on to finish his comments, and I'd love to share them with you in this way. This is what he says about this poem. The quote, "The thought of the poem could be stated flatly in prose, but no paraphrase could be made to contain the sense of struggle to express things never yet attempted in rhyme." He quotes from Milton's opening lines of Paradise Lost. That the poem conveys by a gnarled, compact vitality like that of a tree growing just below the timberline. It is precisely this communicable energy of mind that we most value in Emily Dickinson's writings. What a brilliant insight. Energy of mind. Her obscurities are less frequent and less baffling than those of Donne or Browning or George Meredith or Gerard Manley Hopkins, and no less than theirs are worthy of patient interpretation. I love that he joins them all together in this way. At 2B, well, the alliteration here is magnificent. Mermaid, mere mouse man moved me. It is brilliant. The game that she plays into here in Oriole Sing. She'll play a similar kind of game where she'll say things like the following. Rune none in stanza 4. The rhymes are odd, right? She's playing a metrical game here as well, and her game is to make you stop and think, where is the music of Emily's poetry? Where does it reside? And obviously it's where it's with us. You'll remember that Thoreau said in Walden, now to 3A, that it is not all books that are as dull as their readers, end quote, from his passage from Walden called Reading. We've given full lectures on it at learnstrong.net. Finally, at 3B, what is for you the most beautiful sound that you've ever heard? And do you agree with Emily in this poem that art and beauty is in the eye of the beholder or the listener? I hope that Emily's challenging you. Of course, Keats played the same game, and Grecian Urn, didn't he? Thank you.